Charlie Bahnson. I'm the veterinarian for the department. Been here for about 4 years. But anyway, yes, thank you for the chance to talk about CWD. I'm going to kind of talk about broad history of CWD and the disease itself, and then kind of fold in some of the highlights or high points from the document that you guys have there. So going back, this is the CWD distribution 20 years ago in 2002. So at that point, we had known about CWD in free-ranging deer since the 1980s, but it was really kind of this curiosity that had just been just kind of smoldering in Colorado and Wyoming. But right at the turn of the century, around 2000 to 2002, it was detected in a number of other areas: Wisconsin, Saskatchewan, Nebraska, South Dakota, and so ultimately we realized that it was more places than we had previously appreciated. And so a number of state wildlife management agencies, ourselves included, started to kind of get together and put together some ideas, some plans to maybe curve the progression of this disease, knowing what we did at the time. And North Dakota was no different. So this is the plan that we had in 2002. But 20 years later, this is the distribution. So 20 years later, you can see that we now know of CWD being in a much wider footprint, really across much of North America, to the point where there's really very few wildlife agencies that are not involved in CWD to some degree. But at the same time, in those 20 years, science continued to evolve as well. These are scientific peer-reviewed papers, just 10 here, but there are many hundreds that have come out in the past 20 years. And these are really the gold standard by which we understand a phenomenon, these scientific papers. And none of these offer a one single silver bullet, but collectively they contribute to the body of knowledge, how we understand this phenomenon out in nature. And so when we make decisions, when we understand CWD, we default back to these as a foundation. And in these past 20 years, we're now armed with quite a lot more than we had, in 2002. And at that same time, shared experience continued to evolve as well. So this is a document. It's the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, and so this includes all of the game and fishes or DNR equivalents from across the country. The veterinarians and biologists from all these different organizations came together and assembled this document that includes really the full spectrum of options out there to manage CWD. So what do we know about the disease? This is a disease of cervids, so moose, elk, reindeer, but especially deer is what we'll talk about today. We know that this deer can be infected in a variety of ways, so through direct contact with another infected animal, through indirect contact, through environments contaminated with bodily fluids from an infected deer, urine, saliva, feces. And then even we know that carcasses that are infected that are left out in the landscape can be a source of infection for years afterwards. So these are all transmission mechanisms, but regardless of how it happens, once this deer becomes infected, the clock starts ticking, and in about 1.5 to 2 years later, it'll reach this point where it starts to rapidly lose body condition. It's excessively urinating, salivating. It becomes what we call neurologic, so it's got a disease of the brain and is acting erratically, but it invariably will die. It's 100% fatal. But one of probably the crux of the whole thing, or what makes this a really confounding issue to deal with, is what happens in this interim, what this deer looks like for the majority of this period of time. And that's a perfectly healthy deer. And so despite the fact that this clock is ticking, we know that this animal is coming into contact with other animals and potentially infecting them. Its bodily fluids are infectious. And it can potentially move this disease to other areas, either on hoof or in the back of a truck. We've also come to appreciate that, even though there's this, fairly dramatic end stage of the disease, this deer actually does start to decline well before that. And so the rates of predation actually increase. They're more likely to get hit by cars, and presumably are just less adept at navigating all the challenges that our deer in North Dakota face. CWD is caused by a prion, and it's just important to point that out because that's different from a virus or a bacteria or even a protozoa, which cause all of our other infectious diseases out there. And with prion diseases, we don't have a treatment for it. It's invariably fatal. There is no vaccine for it. It's invariably fatal, as I mentioned. And also problematically is once areas become contaminated with prions like this, there's no reliable way to decontaminate them. And so, that's all, I guess, kind of curious, kind of interesting, maybe a little bit sci-fi a little bit, but ultimately, why do we care about this in North Dakota? Well, and I'm sorry if this is kind of ringing, I'll try to be less enthusiastic. It's easy to dismiss the importance of CWD because early on it's this one infected deer among an entire herd. And so, not terribly important. But the problem is that with time, this is an infectious disease. And so, again, through those different routes of transmission, the nose-to-nose contact, the contact with infected environments, we know that this disease spreads to where we can get these really high infection rates. And as it spreads, it becomes this year after year thing. And so unlike these cyclical issues like EHD or hard winters, which certainly are dramatic and have an effect, this becomes a mounting disease pressure that remains year after year after year. But it begs the question, and I apologize if you can't see these two colors. You just have to take my word for it that there's, a number of these are orange. But it begs the question that, what happens when you have such dramatically high infection rates in a herd? And we really don't have to speculate anymore. We have a number of studies that have come out in the last several years that have documented this. Now, there's lots of anecdotal reports, but ultimately we have these to lean against. And these studies are, they're difficult, they're expensive, they take several years to conduct, logistically they're difficult, but the study design itself is actually fairly simple. You simply take a bunch of deer, you collar them, you see which ones are positive, which ones are negative, and you just watch them over time to compare mortality between the two, and then you take those differences in mortality, factor in how many are infected, how many are not infected, and then you can get some good estimates of what's going on. So some hard numbers. These are two studies that looked at both the whitetail deer and the mule deer in a deer herd in southeastern Wyoming. So the mule deer, about a quarter prevalence, 24% were infected. Of the CWD negative deer, about 76% annual survival. That's kind of what we expect to see in North Dakota. Of the positive deer, about only a third of them survived annually. And so when you factor in these three numbers, over the study period, the course of the study period, there was an annual population decline of 21%. Looking at the whitetail deer, about 35% prevalence. The negative animals, about similar survival as our mule deer. 40% survival of the positive animals annually, and that equated to an annual population decline of 10.4%. So ultimately, what we know is that high infection rates pose a serious threat to the long-term health of our deer population. And I showed you 4 different studies from western herds, but we have a couple of ongoing studies in eastern states, and preliminary evidence is falling in line or suggesting the same thing. So a very grave implications for this disease. And then again, problematically, once established on the landscape, eradication is probably unlikely, certainly very unfeasible once it's established. So where are we at in North Dakota? So, this is our starting point, 2002, and you can see the date here in the top left, or the year. So we went for a handful of years, about 7 years of some pretty systematic sampling throughout the state. And in 2009, we joined the club. We had our first positive down here in Unit 3F2. We went for another, oh gosh, I guess it was 9 years of picking up 1 or 2 positive animals over the several hundred that we would test down there, but fairly stable and fairly confined to 3F2. But then up in 2017, our neighbors across the border in Saskatchewan picked up 2 different positive mule deer right across from 3A1, so we were a bit nervous. Sure enough, that hunting season, we found our first positive in 3A1. And quite frankly, we've been finding new positive units every year since then. So most recently in 2021, you can see, factoring in over here in Minnesota, some of the bordering detections as well as our own, that quite a few of our units we've documented the presence of CWD. Now, so this is what we call distribution, where it is located, and that's really important for managing CWD, but also how common it is. Our prevalence is also really important. So looking down at Unit 3F2, you can see here our prevalence is on the left, dates on the right. So we went for about 10 years where we were just below 2%, 1 to 2% of all mule deer across the unit being infected. And then in the last couple of years, we've jumped up to where we're about 5% in the last couple of years. We don't have quite as thorough of a data set up in 3A1, but you can kind of see that we're in that same neighborhood. 6 to 7% of mule deer in 3A1 are infected. Now that's important, and we have some stuff to put this in context. So this is 2 different studies that are overlapped. So it's kind of a busy figure, but similar measures. We have prevalence over here, year down here. And the first study is actually this dashed line and these dots here. So in 2000, Mike Miller and a bunch of his crew from Colorado did some modeling and basically modeled out kind of the projection of how CWD spreads within a herd. And what you can see here is that for about 10 to 20 years, you stay below this threshold of easy detection, so like 1%. Pretty hard to find a disease when it's only at 1%. But with time, you actually start to climb up here, and you reach this 5 to 10% range where all of a sudden you expect this exponential increase in prevalence year after year. So that was, certainly interesting, and modeling has its value for, understanding a disease phenomenon. But that same group in 2018 came back and looked at, I believe it was 7 or 8 different hunting units, and looked at the prevalence change over time and overlaid it with this. So that's all these different colored dots here, and then and then applied a trend line here. So not quite a clean lineup, but still shows this same trend of increase that you can expect following detection within a unit. So we've talked about kind of the implications, the seriousness, the graveness of CWD, but ultimately, if there's a bright side to the topic in North Dakota, it's that we're not at this point yet where we have these high infection rates. We're still very much at this point where we have an opportunity to try to keep it in check before basically the ship sails, and our options are quite limited. So our timeline here again, for the past 20 years, our department has been working pretty hard to keep up with it. We've tested over 40,000 deer. We've followed the science and applied our different tools to the extent that made sense and we were able. And by and large, we're happy with the results that's gained us. But here we were 20 years later, and there was time to stop and do a really comprehensive reassessment of where we're at and where we hope to go. And so with that background, the task force for Game and Fish was formed. We had some fairly broad topics or purposes. The first was this status review of CWD surveillance and management in North Dakota that we've talked about. And then after that, we read nearly all of the state wildlife management plans for CWD that are available across the country. So, read some really good ones, some less good ones, but hopefully took the best parts of those plans and folded them into what we're doing. Also did a pretty comprehensive review of that document I talked about, a 111-page document. Again, looking at what management options out there make sense to apply here in North Dakota. And then a lot of discussion, factoring in kind of the shared experience within our task force, but also really factoring in, all the public input that we receive from you guys and others. And so here we are at the plan. And as Casey kind of alluded to, as we started to really hammer out the details of this plan, our mission statement really did fall central to how we were able to make the right decisions. So Casey already kind of read it, but one interesting thing, I end up talking to classes a fair amount, and I always like to lead with our mission statement because it really signals, why we do what we do. And Casey did a good job of reading it, but he actually missed this word, sustain, which I always try to emphasize. What we do is for sustained public consumptive use and non-consumptive use. So both for our enjoyment today and tomorrow and hopefully years to come, but also the folks that are going to follow us. Those are the folks that we serve in trying to preserve healthy wildlife populations. So it is a management and surveillance plan, and so we'll get into some of the high points of these topics. And so when we talk about management, there's two fairly broad goals. And again, although it's a fairly complicated system with a lot of inputs, the management goals themselves are fairly straightforward. So first is to keep infection rates low in positive areas, so slow down how we go from this point to this point. And then second would be keep CWD out of negative areas, so halt or slow down how fast it gets from this point to this point. And really this becomes a game of managing risk. And so managing risk is a matter of looking at a disease system, looking at what we know about it, looking at these various methods of transmission, and ultimately trying to curtail those methods of transmission. So reducing risk equals reducing transmission. And so these different topics I'll talk about apply for those general goals. Now, of course, also signaling to what Jeb said about opinions and controversy, baiting certainly generates a lot of spirited conversation within our state. And I can say that a lot of times when we're talking about this baiting or part of larger conversations, a lot of times the different points that are brought up fall under the ethics around baiting. To what degree is it consistent with fair chase? We hear about the idea of an ethical shot, and I can say that really all of those issues around ethics are not why we as Game and Fish are involved with influencing baiting. Those topics of ethics, we can let folks resolve on Facebook. I'm 0 for 2 on that joke, just so you know. That landed just about as well in Fargo. But as somebody said, maybe you guys are all Twitter people. I don't know. But anyway, so but no, we focus on the issue of baiting because of the biological implications that it has in terms of spreading disease. And so when we think about keeping the infection rate low in CWD positive areas, we realize that anything that is going to bring these animals into congregation or bringing them close together is going to increase these direct contacts and these indirect contacts. And so, the more often that happens, the more intense it happens, the longer that it happens, the faster that we're going to perpetuate this disease. And importantly, again, there's that environmental contamination component. So if we have these concentrated areas where there's a lot of biological buildup of urine, saliva, feces, even after these deer are gone, we provide potential areas to perpetuate the problem moving on. Now, another line of conversation around baiting is the well-founded idea that deer are social animals. They are going to interact anyway. There's going to be nose-to-nose contact. There's going to be natural transmission out there. And, we certainly, are aware of that. We acknowledge that. That's certainly something out there that we can't control. But I think we can kind of all relate to the experience of being around somebody that was sick, right? And you kind of find out later on and you never actually got sick. That's a pretty relatable scenario, particularly in recent years. But we can also kind of appreciate that the longer you were with that person, or the more close proximity you were with that person, or the more sick people you were around, ultimately you're increasing the likelihood that you were going to tip that scale and become infected. And so when we think about this natural transmission, we can't use that as a reason to justify perpetuating the issue with all these other ways of congregating animals. Another thing that we hear about a lot is the fact that deer often will yard up or winter up for portions of the year. And certainly, absolutely, if you drove on I-94 this winter for a couple of months, there was a big group of deer kind of right by Dawson. I looked at them every time I drove past. And that is absolutely a period of time where there's some risk of transmission. Fully acknowledge that. But again, with that same logic, we can't use that as a reason to justify perpetuating it. And so when we think about pre-baiting in July and August, when we think about our various hunting seasons that start in September and go to the beginning of January, we can't use that as a way to extend that calendar year in terms of when these risky things are happening. So I kind of burned through some of the high points, but I'll just defer you to, it's only about a page and a half, but it's pretty densely packed with further points of issues, some further references, some further evidence that supports the fact that baiting contributes to the risk of CWD spread. But on to the plan, how we plan to move forward. Again, the task force, this generated a lot of conversation, back and forth, thinking about public input. But ultimately, where we landed is to continue doing things the way that we've been doing them. And so any unit that falls within 25 miles of a positive detection gets included within the baiting restricted area. Now, we certainly hear strong opinions on either side. This is a compromise, and compromise has a way of kind of leaving nobody terribly satisfied. We do have quite a few people that strongly suggest that we just go to a statewide baiting ban. And in fact, none of our adjacent states allow hunting over bait. But again, this is a compromise. We're trying to respect the wishes of folks who really enjoy using baiting in their hunting traditions and practices. And so we're going to try to continue to allow that to happen. But where we know that there's a disease risk, we simply can't justify allowing that to continue. So on to carcass transportation and disposal. So again, thinking about this timeline of the deer, we know that most of the hunter harvested deer that test positive in North Dakota look and act overtly healthy. And so it's quite possible for a well-intentioned hunter to harvest this animal and haul it to a new area. And we know that most of the carcass is going to have some level of CWD, but it's particularly concentrated in the brain and spinal cord. And so when these things are left out on the landscape, that poses a serious risk of spreading the disease to new areas and helping it become established. So early on, for I guess it was 10 years, it was pretty easy to address this risk when we had CWD just in one unit. In Unit 3F2, those high-risk carcass parts had to stay in the unit, and that was kind of the end of the story. Unfortunately, that status changed, and we have 8 hunting units now where we're trying to contain this risk. And given the fact that we know that CWD likely exists outside of this gray area, also given the fact that we allow transportation between adjacent units, the value of this restriction was starting to fade as that window got wider and wider. So when you think about curtailing that risk, you kind of have two options. The first was our approach, drawing the line at the border. But the second approach is trying to influence what happens at the end of the process once the animal arrives home. And so I put together kind of a cartoon. I'm not sure how helpful it is, but we'll say that this is the unit here. And so previously, if you were going to haul this across a unit, either to your home or the taxidermist or the meat locker, you had to do quite a bit of processing. Get rid of those high-risk carcass parts, and either leave them at the location of harvest or hopefully deal with them appropriately, or look for a taxidermist or meat locker within your unit, which could actually be pretty difficult when we're thinking about some of our more sparsely populated areas. So alternatively, we plan to actually transition to a new policy where your options are to either leave the high-risk carcass parts at the location of harvest, which again is fine, but you can actually transport those into new areas of North Dakota, either home or a taxidermist or a meat locker. But ultimately, those high-risk carcass parts, the things that are left over after processing the animal, after taxidermy, those need to end up in a landfill, either directly or with use of a waste hauler, other methods, ultimately so that they land or end up in the landfill. We realize that there's a fair amount of education that'll go there, but excited about the possibility or the fact that doing this will allow us to really make use of our partners kind of in new units, whether those are taxidermists or meat lockers that previously we just kind of had to say, we're sorry, but didn't work with the previous regulations. A couple of really important things for this transition is that the same rules will apply as before for carcasses transported from outside of the state. So if you go to Montana, if you're going to bring that carcass back, that stuff needs to stay in Montana. We're not planning to allow movement into the state from those other areas. And again, as I mentioned, realize that this is a pretty big transition for some folks, so we'll definitely accompany this with a lot of outreach, a lot of communication, communicating with waste haulers. We have offered some disposal areas in the past, and so looking at how we can fold those in to really make this the most workable for hunters, but ultimately contain the most amount of risk that carcass waste presents. I'll probably make the same point later on, but I do really want to point out that this potential change would go into effect for next year, 2023. So 2022, the season that starts in a few weeks here, was the old rule. So please don't transport stuff out of 3F2. So anyway, again, I'll probably make that same point later. Now we've talked about baiting and carcass transportation and disposal, and those are two things that are really aimed at trying to curtail the risk, but a pretty exciting tool that we've really already employed and have continued to be optimistic about is hunter harvest. We've long said that hunter's gun is our most important tool for managing this issue and frankly for managing most of our wildlife issues. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense. We have identified areas that are certainly higher infection rates, and so if we can focus some harvest, particularly around those areas, we do a number of things. One is we get positive animals off the landscape sooner, so we're decreasing how many animals those positive animals are going to infect. We decrease population density, and so potentially reducing some of those interactions. But then also one thing that these high infection areas create is a problem. Maybe deer are going to move out of there, and so if we can locally decrease the deer density, we discourage that kind of movement and hopefully influence net movement inward instead of outward. And this has actually been borne out by a couple of pretty exciting recent studies. One I'll point out is this one that came out last year by Connor et al. And again, kind of a busy graph, but ultimately baseline harvest and timing, you see this curve, and as they applied consistent, sustained, and sufficient hunting pressure over time, they found that they flattened the curve. And I forgot to point out that this is a meta study. So they looked at, I think it was 8 or 9 western states and provinces, and I believe it was 32 hunting management areas, and piled this data together to document this effect. And so when we think about how to apply this in North Dakota, we'll have some pretty important thresholds. And so this is just sort of a hypothetical curve. We hope to more mimic this blue line and try to avoid the orange line here. But ultimately, there's 3 really important thresholds. So first would be when we first find it in an area, then 5% detection, and then 10% detection, and that's unit-wide. So 5% of all harvested animals across the unit. So early on, when we first find a deer in a unit, we'll actually maintain our long-term harvest goals. That's, many things factor in, but approximately 15% of our winter deer density, in a ratio of about 40 to 60 antlerless to antlered. We'll also certainly accompany detection with outreach, making people aware of what we're finding there, but ultimately maintaining kind of the same harvest goals that we had before. When we come into a unit and find that we have 5% prevalence, that's when we'll actually start to turn up the dial a bit on our license allocation. So again, going from approximately 15% up to 25%, and then actually skewing the ratio a little bit more towards the antlered. So from a 40-60 ratio to 30-70 ratio. In our data set, it's quite clear, and many other western states have found a clear demonstration that mature bucks have a higher likelihood of infection, and so it makes most sense to focus our tool on those animals that are more likely to be infected. And then, importantly, we realized that you can't just kind of make it rain with licenses, throw a bunch of licenses into a unit and let it take care of itself. We know that access to these deer is a critical component of that. And so we'll accompany this increase in license allocation with some very concerted efforts to expand access, working with landowners and who will be just pivotal partners in this effort. Now, when we get to 10%, we're particularly concerned because we're very close to this exponential phase where we can anticipate rapid increases in prevalence. So that's when we would start to think about more outside of the box things like special management hunts, management subunits, adjusting season timing, optimizing harvest, things of that nature. And so we'll talk about surveillance here in a second, but generally, the way it'll work is that we'll come into a unit and get a very comprehensive prevalence estimate from our surveillance effort, which will then generate a harvest goal, which we talked about. And then we'll maintain that same harvest goal for 5 years. With other things that factor in, we'll adjust as necessary, but generally maintain that harvest goal for 5 years. And then 5 years later, we come back in, we conduct surveillance and just see where we're at. Have we dropped prevalence? Have we maintained? Do we need to move up to the next threshold and consider some more aggressive tactics? And so that's a good pivot. We've talked about management, moving on to surveillance. That 20 years ago, it was recognized that it's important to start looking at hunter-harvested animals to see if we have the disease out there. And they devised a scheme at that time where they split up the state into thirds. And then, but then once we started to find CWD in areas, it started to make sense to also include these areas where we could anticipate finding the disease sooner. And so we kind of came up with this amalgamation of a large portion of the state that we were trying to conduct surveillance on. And thank you to anybody in the room that's ever contributed a sample. That's very important, but you're actually kind of a minority. Despite a lot of effort, we could just very rarely ever get more than 5% of license holders to turn in a head for sampling. And that just translated to very imprecise data and pretty pretty hard to make important decisions based off of such incomplete data. So moving forward, we plan to actually divide the state into smaller units. So instead of going kind of a mile wide and inch deep, we plan to split it up into fifths and test or work much harder making use of different sample sources that are documented in your plan to try to get to our surveillance goals. And so what that means is that previously we were testing, for example, Unit 3F2 every year, and we'll actually move away from that. So if we are over here in the Northeast, we won't be back to 3F2 for 4 years. And importantly, want to let folks know that that's not because we're abandoning 3F2. We are still very interested with what's going on there. Still actively trying to contain that issue. But ultimately, annual small changes are not as important as a very good estimate every 5 years. That being said, we also, if you've hunted in 3F2, you've probably noticed that testing is very much available as a, somewhat for our purposes, but also somewhat as a service that we can provide to folks that like to get a test result in order to make a more informed decision. And so, that passive drop-off barrel won't be there, but with the changes in our transportation restrictions, you'll be able to bring that animal to a district office where we can get a sample. And alternatively, we plan to make self-sampling much more available. So this is just kind of a picture, but the way it will work is you get online, you request a sampling kit, our health biologist, Brent, will mail this to you. You collect that sample, put it in the mail, ship it back to us, we'll get you a test result. Pretty excited about how we can provide this service to our hunters, and this is really a direction that a number of other states have gone, and far and away it's been quite successful. So those instructions will be accompanied with a lot of instructional videos or other things that are needed to help you get those samples, but I think you'll be surprised by how doable it is. And so I just have this slide to point out that, I did hit some of the highlights, but there's a lot of other stuff in there. And so, please do read through it and, let us know what you think. We'd welcome feedback. But here's where I was going to emphasize it one more time. But do just want to point out that these changes would go into effect for next hunting season. So again, 2022 is the same as before. Just make sure to keep that in mind. So finally, what can you do to help with this issue of chronic wasting disease? First and foremost is go hunting. I've hopefully emphasized it enough, but hunters are our most important tool. They're how we maintain healthy wildlife populations. Frankly, it's why all of us are here, is because we enjoy hunting so much. Stay informed on the issue. There's a lot of theories, a lot of strong opinions about CWD, and they can kind of be made available anywhere. But just encourage you to try to vet that information, and would just say that we do have a list of sources on our webpage that are a good starting point for staying up to date on the issue. Stay up to date on regulations as well. This is our proclamation for this hunting season, which governs what regulations are in place related to CWD. And then help with surveillance. If we're conducting surveillance in a unit that you're hunting, please do consider submitting a sample for us. And then dispose of carcasses appropriately. So the best, regardless of when, the best place for those high-risk carcass parts is either at the location of harvest or buried in a landfill. So some final thoughts here. I guess the final thought would be that, I think you probably all kind of know, but everybody wearing the badge here tonight is also a avid hunter and fisherman. And so like you guys, we're very passionate about it. It's why we got into this profession. It's probably why you guys all came tonight, and that's a great thing. And so I guess I've been at this game long enough to realize that that this is probably not the last conversation that I'll have about CWD. I imagine that many folks wherever are probably still a bit unconvinced or skeptical, and that's fine. I always say that healthy skepticism is really important. But as we move forward in those discussions, I think we can all agree that we ultimately want the same thing, which is a robust, healthy deer herd that can be enjoyed, this year, next year, long into the future. That enthusiasm that we all have was a gift to us, certainly, from fathers, grandfathers, previous generations. Let's try to just make sure that we keep that enthusiasm and that obligation to pass on that rich heritage to the future, into the future as we move on. So anyway, that's about all I have. Ending with the final page of our document here, but I do appreciate everybody coming, and I will hand off the microphone to Casey.